So again, good afternoon. Good afternoon to my participants and panelists today. Good afternoon and salam alaikum to all those that are viewing this Facebook Live webinar. We really appreciate you spending some time with us. My name is Afaf Nasher. I'm the Executive Director for CARE New York, the Council on American Islamic Relations New York chapter. And it really is a pleasure to be talking about this topic today, which is a discussion on elections and voter access and how this pandemic has actually impacted all of that and the kinds of new issues that are coming about and really being put into the limelight, being focused upon because of this pandemic. And one of the reasons that I thought, as well as my panelists thought, this topic was particularly of huge importance is because we're so focused on the pandemic, it can really we can lose the importance and lose off of our to-do list, our civic engagement responsibilities as citizens. And this is certainly not a time to be doing that and to be forgetting about our voting and who is running for elections, because as we can see, we've got, stimulus plans involving trillions of dollars. We've got leaders who are making life and death decisions. And if anything, this should be a reminder to us that we must be civically engaged as citizens, and we must make sure that our voice is heard, especially for moments like these. So let's go to our panelists. I have Brother Ali Najmi and Susan Lerner. They're both excellent panelists. I'm so excited to have you both. And I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to please introduce yourselves, the kind of work you do, the organizations that you work with, and then we'll go into the questions. Susan, would you like to begin? Ladies first.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm Susan Lerner. As Afaf said, I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause New York. And Common Cause is a 50-year-old organization that works to strengthen our democracy around the nation. We were baptized by the Watergate scandals. We've been involved in all of the major reforms to deal with money in politics, voting rights, and ethics at the federal and state levels around the country. And I'm the executive director of the New York chapter, which has taken some public positions in the last 2 weeks regarding how our elections should be conducted in this time of public health emergency, and also how our government should continue to function. Just as we all are working remotely, government is going to need to figure out for itself how they can do the people's business publicly but safely.
Thank you so much, Susan. Appreciate that effort and that work that you do. And Brother Ali, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure thing. Assalamu alaikum. I'm an attorney in private practice. One of my practice areas is election law, where I have the privilege of representing candidates in advising them on ballot access petitions and how to get their name on the ballot. And we're in the thick of that practice right now, actually. I'm also a co-founder and board member of the Muslim Democratic Club of New York, and helping engage responsible Democrats, electing them to office and highlighting our community's viewpoints and agenda.
So as we go through this discussion, I guess I should always point out, especially as a nonprofit, that we don't endorse one party over another, and we're not going to be speaking about party politics, nor are we going to be speaking about particular people in elections, but rather what we want to understand is our role in this critical moment. What elections are coming up? What kind of voter access are we having, considering, social distancing rules and the kinds of things that should be on the forefront of our mind as civically engaged citizens? So to jump right into that, maybe Brother Ali, you can remind us of what elections here in New York City and maybe throughout the state, if there are any, with regards to, what elections were supposed to take place and what has happened to them.
Well, the first election that we were supposed to have was the Queens Borough President's special election. And I represented a candidate in that election, Councilman Costa Constantinidis. There's several other candidates running in that race. That election was basically postponed and then later canceled. And it's a really difficult time to be a candidate. I mean, people who are running for borough president have spent millions of dollars thinking there would be an election, and then it completely gets canceled. The Campaign Finance Board, which gives matching funds, still owes them money that was spent, but it's been canceled. So now the CFB doesn't want to release the money. We have a presidential primary coming up in April 28th, and we have a statewide primary for state elections, assembly, state senate, and lower level party positions like district leader in June 23rd. There's been a lot of rumor and chatter that maybe some of these election dates may change. Maybe the June primary won't happen. But that's the landscape right now. But, you know, as of right now, we are supposed to have the April 28th presidential primary and the June 23rd state primary.
So as it stands right now, you said we may still be seeing the April 28th primary. That's the presidential primary, right? But we're not really sure. I think we're going to have to stay tuned. And let me go to Susan. Susan, for these, you know, postponements, where should people even be going to get this information? I mean, the Queensborough president race is something that's you know, it pertains to one county. But then when we're talking about the presidential election, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's huge. How do people stay in tuned? Where are they supposed to be going for this latest information?
So, you know, there really are a lot of elections which are up in the air. Virtually all of the organizations, all of the election administrators, the New York State Board of Elections, and virtually all of the newspapers now have called on the governor of the legislature to consolidate the April and the June primaries together. The city has asked the governor to combine the special elections for the Queensborough president and the Council District 37 into one special election and have that special election for those two vacant city offices held at the same time as whenever the next primary is going to be. And, you know, it's up to the governor and the legislature to figure this out for us. There's some very specific asks that have been made. Where people get the information really is, frankly, from the boards of elections, and they are not always the best at getting the word out. So we would hope that if a decision is made to continue or consolidate an election to a different date, that would be up on the Board of Elections website as fast as possible. Here in New York City, we have NYC Votes, which is another website. But then the question is, what about people who are on the wrong end of what we call the digital divide, who don't have reliable Wi-Fi and who need some other source of information? And the newspapers have been doing a pretty good job in terms of keeping people apprised of these kinds of changes. But I think it's going to be a responsibility of all of our organizations and everybody who cares about elections to get the word out, if indeed, as I expect, some of these dates are going to change.
Absolutely. And, you know, these delays are not just impacting, of course, voters, they're impacting candidates, as Brother Ali had sort of mentioned. And Brother Ali, I understand that there's reduced qualifications for candidates. And I think this is sort of important to bring up because, you know, there's a level of qualification that each candidate usually has to get to in order to put his or her name on the ballot. And I know within the Muslim community and many communities that have been once marginalized are really making a push to get candidates from their communities out into, you know, the realm of politics so that they could have a direct voice in government as well. So can you just maybe talk to us a little bit about what that's looking like?
Sure. So the governor did reduce the number of signatures you need to qualify for the ballot by 70%. So it was 500 signatures you needed for assembly. Now you just needed 150, but you always have to get more than the minimum requirement because there's a whole process where people challenge each other's signatures for accuracy and for whether they're legitimate. And he also reduced the petition period by about 3 weeks. So this actually completely, changed the dynamic of the campaigns for people. For people like myself who were in charge of getting the petitions filed, it completely changed what we were doing when we were doing it. But we got it all done. All the petitions have been filed. We do have a record number of people from the Muslim community running and that are on the ballot this year. We have candidates like Zoran Mamdani in Astoria, Mary Jobaida in Woodside, Shania Chaudhry in Southeast Queens. So it's an interesting year for the community, and a lot of these campaigns are looking really strong and hopeful. And now there's so much uncertainty. It's so difficult to be a candidate right now. How can you even ask people to donate to your campaign? People aren't making money anymore because of COVID-19. How can you ask somebody to even think about an election when they're thinking about their mom or their dad or their grandma? Or it's thinking about an election is a privilege, actually. And right now, a lot of people don't have that privilege.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess my response to at least partially answer those questions is, you know, like we mentioned before, the $1 trillion of government, of our money, the citizens' money that's going to be spent in response to this pandemic will hopefully, if people are civically engaged and have a voice, help somebody's mother, you know, in their moments of crisis. But that can only happen if our legislators really remember that it's our voice that they're carrying forward when they make these decisions. And, you know, and civic engagement, I think, just both short-term and long-term, has to be something that is a primary concern, because ultimately there are life and death decisions that are being made. So
Sure.
Susan, you know, coming back to you with regards to these disruptions, I mean, you know, Brother Ali spoke a little bit about the disruptions to the candidates on that side. Well, let's talk about these disruptions and how they've impacted voter access issues, right? So we know, you know, people who are registered, people who are expecting to go vote, people who usually go to a voting site are now saying we got to stay in our room, much less, you know, go to a packed room. So what does voter access look like now, and how has this pandemic impacted the other side of this equation, which is us, the voters? I think you're muted. There we
I
go.
muted myself.
Mhm.
That's one of the reasons, a concern for voters who have traditionally been marginalized, who need assistance, voters with disabilities, voters with language access, voters who are formerly incarcerated or jailed for misdemeanors who would be able to vote, people who just have a hard time getting around. We're very concerned about what is going to happen to those populations if with the changes that need to be made. It's one of the reasons why we feel that the state cannot go to an entirely vote by mail system. What people don't understand is that states which have a vote by mail system also provide opportunities for in-person voting. There are always going to be voters who need assistance, whether it's language assistance, physical assistance. And in a vote by mail system, there are always people who, for whatever reason, their ballot did not arrive in the mail. So every state that has vote by mail still allows you some access to vote in person. And so we believe that what's needed is a combination of loosening the standards for absentee ballots, expanding early voting. Early voting is a really good reform that deals with emergency situations. And it works in our current situation because it takes the voters, spreads voters out over a longer period of time so that you are much less likely to have lines or interact with a large number of people. And there are specific recommendations which the CDC and the Federal Election Administration Commission has made on how to keep voting places actually safe in terms of providing protective gear for poll workers, in terms of a schedule to wipe down all of the machines and all of the surfaces, to ensure that there is distancing within the polling place. And so we think that there's going to have to be some combination of a much easier way to get and cast an absentee ballot, but also appropriate protections in place for the people who are going to need to vote in person, because we're always going to have some people who are going to want or need to vote in person.
So before we get into the different types of ways that some states vote, which is something I want to explore a little bit further, Susan, you mentioned early voting, and you know, us New Yorkers think we're so progressive, but actually early voting was just recently won, right? It was a long time battle. And even till now, I don't think too many people know about early, not as many people as should know about it anyway. So could you please just remind our public what rules are in play now for early voting? What access they have?
Sure. So the legislature, in its very first day in 2019, passed early voting as part of a package of election reforms. And early voting allows you to vote in person without having to have any reason to do so, just because you want to vote before Election Day at a designated polling place. And New York was the 39th state to finally catch up and adopt early voting. The early voting system we have in place right now allows you to vote in the 2 weekends immediately before the election day. And that's any election. That's the primary, that's special elections, that's the general election. During the week in between those 2 weekends, where you can vote during the day, and then there will be 2 evenings where you have access to an early voting location in order to vote at the time that makes the most sense for you in your life. It helps people who are caregivers for other family members, who work irregular hours, who can't always aren't always able to make themselves free for 1 to 3 or 4 hours on election day. So it takes the pressure off election day. And if the April presidential primary were not continued, then early voting would start on April 18th, which is one of the reasons why we really need the legislature and the governor to decide what they're going to do about the April primary, because the Board of Elections next week needs to start hiring people to work for early voting. So that's the system we have in place. We believe at Common Cause that we should expand early voting in this crisis, make it a full 2 weeks before the election, and increase the number of early voting locations so that more people can vote early without worrying that they will run into too many other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I know in New York City with early voting, we were trying to help with finding designated locations for early voting. So that certainly would help. And that 2-week extension would seem like a good idea as far as social distancing, because it'll just give more people more time to get there. So we'll definitely keep tuned, and thank you for that. And Brother Ali, let me jump to you. So, we're talking about early voting as one possible way where we can alleviate some of the concerns with social distancing, but there are different ways to vote that different states utilize that we currently don't necessarily utilize to the fullest degree, and especially in terms of this pandemic. So I know, for example, we have absentee ballots, some votes vote by mail, which, Susan already touched upon a little bit. We have, this new idea of voting, digitally, right, online or through your phone, which has sort of been experimented with a bit disastrously, I guess I should say. So let's touch upon those. What do you think, Brother Ali, about these types of different forums? What do you like? What don't you like about these? Is there anything else that other states are doing that New York could be doing?
Well, New York at the moment does not have excuse-free absentee in effect. Groups like Common Cause and a lot of other advocates have been working very hard in order to get the legislature to put on a constitutional amendment, and it just, at this moment, it's not the law. The governor did pass an executive order before they canceled the Queensborough president's election. They actually implemented a broad definition that would allow basically anybody to vote in absentee in New York. In New York, you still have to do 2 steps. You have to fill out an application for an absentee ballot in which you have to declare a reason why you're voting absentee. One of those reasons is temporary illness, and the governor's executive order basically said that the COVID-19 spread threat is a temporary illness for the purpose of absentee. So anybody could have done it. He should extend that to the presidential election. It hasn't happened yet. Susan, correct me if I'm wrong. And it has not happened yet for the June primary, which it should. He set up the model through the Queensborough president executive order that he put out. So, I'm sure that he would want to extend it, although I'm not part of any conversations. I think that really there's no way to do this election without excuse-free absentee. He also allowed an online application for absentee ballot, which didn't exist before. You had to do the paper application. It's got to get to the board. This time, the first step was put online in light of this crisis. So we've actually jumped leaps and bounds in terms of absentee rules through this crisis, and hopefully it can continue for these other elections. But let me tell you something. New York State has one of the lowest voter participatory rates, and on a good year, when there's no pandemic, it's 10% participation statewide in a
Terrible.
gubernatorial primary. You know, so now, you know, we're asking people to vote during this pandemic. Excuse-free absentee, I think, is the only hope some of these campaigns have, and then they have to adjust to run an absentee campaign, which is completely different.
Yeah.
But maybe the only hope of campaigning left.
Well, I mean, so Susan, I know you spoke about, all right, absentee ballots. First thing that I'm getting out of this is, as it stands right now, even if we wanted to vote via absentee ballot, we have to apply for it first. And my understanding is that the application basis for that would be illness or fear of illness, right, in general.
Right.
So in case that ends up being the reason, and, you know, again, we have potentially a primary in April, which is right around the corner. What kind of time frame would that even allow for people to get the information, to send, you know, their request, to get the response back, to understand what it means and how to do it? Is that feasible at all? It seems like it's impossible and it's a no-brainer. Why then the holdup?
Well, you know, the election administrators agree with you. They don't see how they can do it in the time that they have available to print enough ballots, to have enough envelopes, to let people know that they can apply to get those applications in. So that's why we and they have all the Election Commissioners Association have basically made the same requests and recommendations that we at Common Cause have, which is loosen the absentee ballot requirement, define what illness is, the way Ali was talking about it. And there's actually a bill in the Senate right now. Senator Biaggi introduced Senate Bill 8015A, which would do exactly that. It would basically say, in a time of pandemic or public health emergency, a fear of getting sick or making other people sick would be a valid reason under the illness justification to get a ballot. And then there wouldn't be any confusion there. You know, Ali mentioned the need to streamline the application process. So emailing your request in, all of these things that have to happen, because without them, the boards of elections themselves are saying, we're not going to be able to respond. We're also hearing that voting locations for election for the primary are pulling out. They say, we don't want the public in our place, or we don't have the capacity anymore. We don't have any employees who are coming in to open up. And that poll workers, you mentioned the fact that traditionally poll workers are older people. That's right. And they are quitting. They're like, I'm not doing this, right? So I think we can make the necessary adjustments for the June primary. I think the political parties and the boards need to be creative in recruiting poll workers. We have how many hundreds of thousands of people out of work in New York City with the necessary skills? Well, recruit from the unemployment rolls, right? This is an opportunity to have a job. It's a part-time job, but it actually pays fairly well for the time that you put in. I think there are people who would jump at the opportunity who aren't in their 70s or 80s and who are better with technology than perhaps some of our older poll workers. So frankly, I don't see how they can get done what they need to get done by April 28th, much less by April 18th, when early voting starts. So we believe that the governor and the legislature are going to do something within the next week, because otherwise it's impossible.
Well, you know what? We've got a whole generation of millennials who, you know, this entire idea of having to fill anything out by paper is just foreign in and of itself. And the question is, and it seems like inevitably we're going to go towards digital voting. So I'm curious to get both of your perspectives on that. Oh, Susan, I think she has, you know, I think she has an opinion formed already on that one. All right, Susan, let's do you first. And then Ali, I'd love to hear your opinion as well on moving towards that trend. Susan.
Look, it would be delightful to be able to do that. Everybody would love it. But the truth of the matter is, it's simply not secure. The technology is not up to it. I've been cautioned not to put my password for anything in an email, right? So sometimes I share an account with a family member and they forget the password. They email me, send the password. I put it in a text because I've been advised that emails can be intercepted and the contents taken out. Well, the same thing can happen with your electronically cast ballot. You just don't know if it's coming from an eligible voter for real, and you don't know that somebody hasn't hacked it or tampered with it in transmission. So unfortunately, all the cybersecurity experts agree we're just not ready for internet voting. And what I hear all the time is people say, well, I file my taxes through the internet. I bank through the internet. Well, two things about that. Number one, when you file your taxes in your bank, the transaction has an identifier that traces back to you. We have a secret ballot, so we cannot do that. And who knows where that one piece of information ends up or who it gets ascribed to. But I'd like to remind people that the banking industry builds in billions with a B, dollars every year for internet fraud because so many people get your password, take your credit card number, all sorts of ways in which people can interfere with internet banking. And the banking industry just takes that as the cost of doing business. We're all paying an extra penny or two per transaction to make up for the stolen money. Well, you can't do that with voting. If the votes are stolen, there's no way to make it up. So people really need to understand that unfortunately the technology just isn't there.
So Brother Ali, who makes up our votes if somebody else takes it? And I have to say, just to put, the more complexity into it, there is something called possible foreign interference with our elections. Brother Ali, what's your opinion on voting via technology digitally?
Look, I think that there has to be a paper backup. That's a state law requirement as well. So you can't just have a purely digital election. There's got to be a paper ballot. But I think that, we should think about electronic and digital engagement of voters. Campaigns have to think about how they engage people now differently. Everybody's got their whole life on their smartphone now. You think about how, if we have to run an absentee campaign in the blink of an eye, how are we going to do that? So I think electronic digital engagement is going to be a huge concern just in the administration of elections and getting your message out. But you're still going to have to ask people to get out of their house and go fill out a ballot, or at least an absentee ballot. There's got to be a paper backup. And this is going to be a real test. Actually, this election will be a real test for how good people's digital campaigns are. Some political groups out there are so valuable because of their canvassing operations. Democratic Socialists of America can bring you 100 people who will knock on doors. Well, what happens now when those people can't show up? Who's got the best game now? So we'll find out. This digital engagement, electronic engagement will be great for persuasion, but legally you still got to get them to fill out a ballot.
So it's an interesting point, Brother Ali, if I can piggyback on it. And, it's a good segue also into our next point of discussion, which is sort of voter access. So normally when we think about voters, we know that it's usually those that are more mature in age who come out to vote. That's just been the reality of it, even though there have been people who've tried to, really spur more engagement with younger voters. But now we're seeing social distancing. Right? We're seeing less and less paper. We're seeing more being invested into digital marketing, for example. So even though we are not necessarily at the point where we can cast our vote digitally, what you're telling us and what this pandemic seems to be highlighting is that more campaigning has to be done digitally. Well, that seems to be a viable way to energize younger voters, but then do we have issues with regards to reaching older voters who might not be as digitally in tune? Are we then losing access of information to that population?
Definitely. Some people are going to get left out from the digital approach. But I think the age of people who are engaged digitally is increasing, and Facebook is filled with old people watching Facebook videos. So, my mom is 78 years old, is on Facebook. So, she will see some videos and talk to me about it, or she'll see an ad and talk to me about it. So I think that, that's gotten less and less of an issue. I mean, now you're gonna have a situation where certain platforms are old and not so cool, like Facebook, and some are hip and young, like Instagram. So you're gonna have different audiences on different platforms, and you have to know where to hit them and who your audience
All
is.
right. I just want to say for the record that I think that the platforms that our more mature audience are viewing and utilizing have some of the hippest and best things on there, right? So I'm not discounting anyone. Yeah, it's true. Some of the younger folks have moved on to Instagram and other forums because of it, but there's still a wealth of information that we can gain from every forum, I would guess.
Yeah.
And Susan, sort of pivoting more towards voter access, and you touched upon this a little bit before. Marginalized communities, people with disabilities, right? So how has everything that's been going on impacted them? How can we make sure that they stay, not only engaged, but that they have the access? Because if we're talking about, for example, voting by mail, how does a person who has vision impairments participate, right? So how about, we talked about marginalized communities. Remind us of where we stand in New York with regards to incarcerated individuals, because it's really at every voice.
That's a really vexatious situation here in New York. Like many states, we prohibit individuals who are incarcerated from voting. That is very much a vestige of the old Jim Crow laws. It was an idea that really gained currency after the Civil War, when it became clear that people of color would actually be able to vote, and were actually voting during Reconstruction after the American Civil War in the 1870s. And all of a sudden, as there were a host of Jim Crow laws, and among them was, if you're incarcerated, you cannot vote. So Common Cause New York and our colleagues and partners in the Let New York Vote Coalition believe strongly that ultimately every New Yorker, irrespective of their relationship with the criminal justice system, should have the ability to vote. Right now, we have a situation where Let New York Vote and Common Cause are advocating to pass a statute that would automatically allow anybody who was formerly incarcerated and now on parole to be able to vote. The current situation is that some people who are on parole are able to vote, but there are a number of administrative steps that have to be taken for somebody on parole to be able to vote. To his credit, Governor Cuomo issued an executive order 2 years ago, which sets up a procedure that allows people on parole to be able to vote. But the procedure is multi-stepped. First, the governor has to issue a voting pardon. It's not a pardon for everything. It's just a pardon that allows the person on parole to vote so long as they are honoring the terms of their parole. And that happens on a monthly basis at this point. The Department of Corrections provides a list to the governor's office. They go through the list, they ensure everybody's in good standing in parole on the list, and then they issue these special voting pardons, which the person on parole receives from their parole officer. The Department of Corrections also maintains a way to look up on their website whether the specific person on parole has received a voting pardon or not. So you can find out, if you are somebody who's on parole, whether your voting pardon has been issued. Then you need to re-register to vote, which is not always the easiest thing to do in New York.
No.
And then you can vote.
Okay.
So there are a lot of ways, there are a lot of places where you can have glitches along the way with that administrative procedure. And that's why we believe that it really would make sense to just pass a law that's a bright line. You're incarcerated, you are obviously not going to be available in the Board of Elections to fill out a registration application. But if your body is on the street, then you should be able to vote, period. That's it. But we're not there yet. So that is something that we are working on. We also work with the reentry community, so the people who have received their voting pardons know that they can re-register and vote. Because what we've seen in numerous communities that allow people to vote is one of the most significant empowering things that a person who is formerly incarcerated can do to feel like they're a full citizen again and a welcomed member of the community is for them to be able to vote.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan. Now, you touched upon something that I think we really need to get into, and that is, this bogged down procedure for registration. Brother Ali, I mean, why do we make registration so difficult? What can we do to improve and ease the process for registration? And we do have a question that came in with regards to registration, and that is, with these extensions and deadlines being moved back, will there be extensions for registration for people who are not registered as well? So where are we with registration?
That's a very good question. I mean, if you are postponing the election, you should kick back the deadline on registration for that election, which, for the presidential one, it expired in February. So
right.
I think right now, I haven't heard anything about extending the deadlines. It's probably going to be even more burdensome for the board if they did that. But, I would say right now, getting registered is not terribly hard. You just have to fill out a form, and you got to make sure that form gets to the Board of Elections. If you go to the DMV, sometimes they'll do it for you right there if you get a license. But you still need you still need a paper form. You could do it online, potentially. You could do it when you have to do something that you got to always do every year, like, say, I don't know, something related to your car registration or your license renewals. But I think for a lot of us, we're succeeding in getting people registered in our community. You have these voter registration drives. People are choosing parties, they're enrolling in them. Every year I see community organizations in our community succeeding in this. The hard part is not necessarily registering, it's turning out the people who are registered. When you look at the data at who's showing up once they're registered, there's a huge gap. So I think that we need to focus on how to turn out the people that are registered.
Well, I mean, personally, I see two aspects of it. Yes, you're right. When I'm out in the community and we do registration drives as well, right? We take those papers out and we really plead with everyone. If you're not registered, come see us, and we'll help to get you registered. But Susan, I think Common Cause has been working for, automatic registration, and other states have it. Where's New York on this? And what does automatic registration mean?
Right. So right now, if you interact with a state agency like the DMV or the Department of Health, they are supposed to offer you the opportunity to register to vote. And if you go on the state's social service portal, they do have a reminder. Click here if you want to register to vote. And that's what we call an opt-in system. It's up to the voter to take advantage of that offer. A automatic voter registration is not universal registration, which I'd like us to see sometime in the future. That is, you're born here, you're a naturalized citizen, you turn 18, boom, you're on the voter rolls, right? The Secret Service can track you down, so should our election authorities, but that's not what automatic voter registration is. Automatic voter registration is a system where when you interact with a state agency, and in many states it's the DMV, it could be when you sign up for Medicaid, it could be any other number of state services. The agency then has all the information that's relevant to actually put you on the voter rolls. They know who you are, they know what your address is, they have your age, and we recommend that it's only agencies that already collect your citizenship status. They have what would go on the voter rolls. And so what would then happen is, unless you tell the agencies, no, I don't want it, your voter relevant information would automatically be transferred to the Board of Elections and they would put you on the voter rolls. So it's what we call an opt-out system instead of an opt-in. It's going to go forward. You're going to get registered unless you, the voter, stop it. And what we've seen in other states is that you get many, many more people registered that way. The system, although, as Ali points out, you can fill out the form, the system is still daunting to some people who get confused with the form, forget to re-register when they move. The automatic voter registration system means that we could put as many as 1 million additional voters, and often, Afaf, in the vulnerable and underserved categories that we were talking about earlier. People who are in the reentry community, low income people who often just find the whole process of voting more than they can handle in already stressed lives. So, we at Common Cause and the Let New York Vote Coalition really have been pushing to get automatic voter registration set up in our state. The DMV alone is not going to do it. In New York City, we have a lot of people who do not drive and who may not interact with the DMV. So Medicaid, the health service, the social services, TANF, those sorts of programs should be, we hope, transitioning to an automatic voter registration system sometime in the relatively near future. And right now we have online voter registration, but it's linked through the DMV. Right. So you have to have a DMV account, which you can set up specifically to register to vote, but most people don't. So we're also transitioning to online voter registration to make it easier for people. There'll be one place that they can go and enter their own information rather than filling out a paper form and somebody else has to type it. And guess what? They misspell your name. They get the numbers of your address wrong, and then everything complicates from there. Online voter registration, chances are you can spell your own name, and chances are you get your address right. So the voter rolls are that much cleaner and more accurate with automatic voter registration and with online registration. And we're expecting to see online registration within the next 2 years. And I'm hoping AVR would have passed by now, but for the COVID-19 emergency.
Oh, wow.
And I'm hoping that if not this year, at the very beginning of next year, the legislature will pass it, and then it will take probably 2 years to implement. And then we'll see a significant increase in the voter rolls. And then, as Ali points out, we've got the challenge of getting those people to vote. But experience in other states shows that if you invite people, instead of putting all of the burden on the voter, if you automatically register people, then they start to get notices. Campaigns start to reach out to them. And what we've seen is that 40 to 60% of the people who are automatically registered turn out and vote for the first time. So we're doing everything we can, not just to expand the voter rolls, but also to get people to actually be empowered and vote.
Okay, well, you know what? I think it's worthy for us to take a minute, and Brother Ali, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. I mean, there are repercussions when registration forms are wrong, for example. There are repercussions when a person changes an address and doesn't, understand that they need to now contact their Board of Elections. And sometimes I know I've seen a lot of confusion within our community. People are saying, am I registered? Am I not registered? They go in to vote. They find out they're not registered. They don't understand why. So there's this purging of registration lists with people who actually want to vote. Here you are trying to do your best to get people registered to come in and vote. And then someone who comes in with the best of intentions wants to do their civic responsibility and cast their vote, and they don't find their name on that, in that book when they go up to the desk to give their name, their ID. So, I mean, can we please speak a little bit about that, how we can overcome those kind of obstacles and what we need to do with regards to this entire system of taking people off of registration without them actually possibly even knowing that they're not registered?
Right. I know from the last presidential election, we had so many people in New York who were so upset with the Board of Elections for being removed from the rolls. And I know Common Cause and a lot of other civil rights groups did a lot of great work on it. The Board of Elections will tell you that they're only going to remove you if you haven't voted like for 10 years straight, because there's no other way for them to figure out who is dead, because nobody sends the Board of Elections a notice. So they want to remove people who they think might have passed away. And so they do these things. But I think for us, for people who are trying to organize blocks of votes in the community, we got to have systems where people's databases are correct. The Muslim Democratic Club in New York tries to keep track of people. Individual candidates and campaigns have been trying to keep track of people. There's a Voter Action Network database that you can share information with everybody in that database. As once you find out information about a voter, people keep track on how often people vote. Triple prime Democrat, double prime Democrat, single prime Democrat are all designations. And so I think that the people who are the most vulnerable in sort of getting dropped out of the roll are like the ones who are who are participating the least. Maybe they've gone a decade without showing up. If you show up and your name's not in the roll, you get an affidavit ballot, which then acts as an automatic re-registration if in fact there was no discrepancy, or if they found out later there was a discrepancy, you're not in the book, but you are a voter, then your vote counts.
Is that something you have to proactively ask for, or is it something that you're supposed to automatically be given?
You're supposed to automatically be given it. But, different things happen in different poll sites. I've had to myself at times instruct poll workers on the Help America Vote Act, which says they must be given a affidavit ballot or a provisional ballot. But I think the solution to this potential problem is that the more you vote, the least likely it is to happen to you.
Good message.
So, Susan, I think you and I touched upon this as well. And, just being taken off of that list can be really so upsetting and really rub people up the wrong way, where they just feel like they're being disenfranchised. Their right is being taken away from them. And sometimes it could be as simple as an address change, right? So what do you recommend for people, or even for the system? How should we change that to allow for these discrepancies so that people's vote in critical times? We've seen in some local areas where votes are decided by really a very small margin of people, maybe 150, 200 people sometimes can swing the vote towards a local elected official. So what are we supposed to do there?
So a couple of things. One, Ali's right. We did a lot of work on this. Common Cause New York sued the city board, and we also sued the New York State Board, because up until now, when you go to vote at your polling place, they have the list of active voters. But if you're removed from the active voter list, there's no list of inactive voters. So people feel horribly disenfranchised when they're removed just arbitrarily from the active voter list. So we sued the state board, and the federal court agreed with us that it was a mistake, that the state is not behaving appropriately for inactive voters. And now all the polling places in the state, when we have in-person voting, are required to have not just the list of active voters, which is the voter rolls, but also a list of inactive voters, so the poll workers can check. And so you can see that you are somewhere in the system, and that you can be fairly assured that your affidavit ballot will count. We're also, we would like to see the situation that if you're on the inactive list, then you cast a regular ballot, but we're going to have to talk to the legislature about that. But there also is something, so if you are voting in person from here on out, you should be able to check. And if you're not on the active voter list, you can demand that the inactive voter list be checked. But more importantly, what we recommend to people is 6 weeks before the election, if you have the capability to get online and check your registration.
Exactly. You can check yourself. There are plenty of websites and organizations where all you have to do, and it's easy, you put in your name, you put in your address, and it'll let you know whether or not you're actively registered, correct?
Right, and absolutely. And that is the safest thing you can do, because then if there's some problem, you can call the Board of Elections, you can re-register, you can ensure that you'll be able to vote. And remember, these websites are available through your smartphone. You don't have to have a computer at home to check your registration. You can do it from a smartphone.
But you
And
have
it's
to do it
closer.
before registration deadlines hit, correct? Because
That's
if you
right.
find out there's a problem and that deadline is hit, then you're caught out of the system.
That's right. So that's why we recommend 6 weeks before the election, if at all possible. And you can always call closer to the election. You can always also call the 1-866-OUR-VOTE hotline. And I think it's, I'm forgetting the Arab language name. Ali, do you know? Is it YOLO vote?
Yellow vote.
Yeah. So that the information, you can be assisted in any number of languages, English, Spanish, Arabic, and also I think there also is Chinese assistance. And they can look up your registration for you if for some reason you aren't able to do it yourself.
All right, let's talk about that. I know we got to wrap it up, but it's just such a great talk. I hope you guys don't mind, and I hope our viewers are enjoying this as much as I am. I'm certainly, really not just engaged on a personal level, but just super excited to learn all this information, and hopefully others will be utilizing it. Brother Ali, we just touched on something super important, especially for immigrant communities, which are pretty abundant here in New York, and that's language access, right? So I can't let this conversation go without talking about language access. I know that, there are some past elections recently, which had a lot of people upset, newly registered voters who thought they could go in. There were some language access issues, but they didn't, receive the language access they thought they'd be receiving, and people were not able to cast their votes, where there's a lot of confusion. Can you please tell us where we are with language access in New York? I know it's maybe different from county to county. New York City may be a little bit more progressive, hopefully, but still not quite there yet, in my opinion. Let's talk about language access and what people can do to make sure that they can still cast their vote, even if English is not their first language or they have trouble understanding English.
Well, there's a lot of opportunity for people who don't speak English to be served at a poll site. If you go anywhere in New York City now, there are going to be translators, interpreters who are in the poll site. The Board of Elections has worked very hard to try to get the right language speakers and interpreters at the right poll sites. They've reached out, to their credit, over the last couple of years, to community groups to recruit interpreters and translators. So if you go to poll sites in Queens, I'm from Queens, and the right poll sites have Bengali and the right poll sites have Punjabi now, and Urdu translators and interpreters, and obviously other languages in Queens are well reflected: Mandarin, Cantonese, Korean, Spanish. Bengali is on the ballot. Actually, you can register to vote and read the candidate's name in Bengali. So right now, as far as the communities that I organize in, the South Asian community, I would say that the languages are reflected in the poll site. The other thing I would say is that voting is something we should do as a family, because we should just go to the polls together. It's a nice way to spend time together, actually. You take a walk with your mom and your kids, and you're increasing your political power, because now you're not just voting yourself, you're delivering 5, 6, 7, mashallah, votes at once if your family's big enough, and you can be there for the people who don't speak. I think that a lot of times we look for the system or the election administrator to help us vote, but we should help ourselves and our families as much as possible.
And therein lies one possible solution. Susan, please remind us all, am I allowed to go in with my mother? It is a secret ballot. Can I be next to her and help her through the language issues?
Absolutely. New York state law holds that you can bring anybody you want to help you, to assist you into the privacy booth, into the voting area. The only exception is you can't bring your boss and you can't bring a union representative. But if it's a family member, even somebody, an 8 or 9-year-old who helps you translate things into English, they are absolutely able to assist you in voting.
So I'll say I'm pretty proud of the fact that we do vote as a family, Brother Ali, me and my kids, my husband, my parents. Sometimes we'll have multi-generations. I know I was really sort of privileged in the sense that my dad really instilled in us the importance of voting. Even if he happened to be traveling abroad, he would call us and say, "Did you guys vote?" And
Wow.
he'd make the effort to go and vote at the embassy as well. So I'm privileged in that. And, I know that's not necessarily the case for everybody, but hopefully we can get more people registered, and then those registered people more to the polling site and actually casting their ballot, making sure these, again, life and death decisions, trillions of dollars being decided here today, making sure that those voices ring in the ears of those that we've elected to power. So my last question to both of you, because I always have to do, the human angle to all this, and you guys have been so phenomenal. I'm just sort of curious as to what really made this such a passion for the both of you. It's very evident that it is. I don't know whether it's something, that you thought your religion helped you with, or perhaps something that you were taught by your parents, like myself, or, what is it that made you super, super passionate about being such leaders in this realm of work? So who do we want to start with? Okay.
Ali.
All right, Ali.
Sure. It's really a disease, and but I've just always been really engaged with elections and politics and power, and I've really gotten the chance to work for elected officials and work now in this new capacity as an election attorney. And I really I've seen progress being made through elections and organizing, and I believe in the process, and I believe in America, and I've seen results, so it keeps me going. And look, sometimes you can learn this lesson the hard way. There are a lot of people who are not happy with current leadership, so that also motivates people and me.
Awesome. And I should mention, I think, Ali, are you the only Muslim, as far as you know, who's doing election law?
There are only like 10 lawyers that do election law in New York City,
Yeah,
so
exclusive.
I think I'm the only person under 55 years old that's doing election law.
Well, that's great. It's inspirational. How about you, Susan? I'd love to hear your personal story.
So I grew up in a community with a very small Jewish congregation, in a farm community. And half the adults in our community, when I was growing up, had numbers on their arms because they were survivors from the concentration camps. And my first experience with engagement was in a time when farm prices were dropping. The community decided to charter a bus and to have community members go down to Washington to talk to their representatives in Congress to ask for support for the farmers. And I was about 12 years old, and I remember being on the bus, and we were coming to, the big monuments, and there was the Jefferson Monument and the Washington Monument. And one of the community members, a gentleman who had survived the concentration camps in Europe, turned to me and said, "Remember how great this country is. 10 years ago, the government in Europe was trying to kill me. And now I am going to talk to my elected representative. America is an amazing place." And I think that experience really was what started me on the path to being an activist.
That's really so super powerful. Thank you so much, both of you, for this reminder of our responsibilities as citizens, our privilege and our honor to take part in this system. We really appreciate all the work that you want to do on a daily basis. Certainly, CARE New York will try to continue to champion these causes with regards to civic engagement in all facets. And you guys are just really such strong coalition members. Let New York vote. I know we're a part of that coalition, which is how I met Susan. So, Brother Ali, keep doing the work that you're doing. You're inspirational within our community. May God bless you both. Please keep safe. Thank you so much for extending your time and your expertise.
Thank you, and looking forward to more opportunities to work with CARE New York.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.